Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very senior and accomplished professional from the world of human resources, an author from Edinburgh, UK, Dr. Susan Hetrick. Susan, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Thank you. Susan is the founder of Zuhra. She's an organizational psychologist and a workplace culture consultant. She's also an author of a book titled Toxic Organizational Cultures and Leaderships: How to Build and Sustain a Healthy Workplace. So, Susan, before we talk about culture, tell me a little bit about your own organization, about your own journey, and a little bit about Zuhra and what is the meaning of the word Zuhra.
Okay, well, maybe I'll start with the meaning of the word Zuhra. Zuhra is actually stems from ancient Sanskrit, and it means warrior for good. Okay. And when I was looking to do work within organizations as an organizational psychologist and expert on workplace culture, that's rung true. That's exactly what we do. We are sort of warrior for good. In sense of my own journey, I have spent 35 years working in many organizations, particularly international organizations, including the World Bank, RBS, or now NatWest, Aegon, HSBC, working across many different sort of sectors as well and organizations. And in my journey, really, it is about making the workplace, a much more sort of positive and healthy place to be for employees and for colleagues.
Well said. So let's talk culture, an area that you have specialized in, Susan. And let me ask a question you've probably been asked many times. How do you define organizational culture, and what is its impact on business success?
Big questions there. So how do we define it? I would define it. I like the way about talking about the way things get done around here, but it's more than that. It's actually how do colleagues speak about each other? How do colleagues speak about each other when someone's not in the room? How do line managers behave? And it's much more about behaviors, and it's much more around those unconscious assumptions that we don't often see. So, we see, you can go into an organization, and the moment that you come up to the reception desk, you've got a sense of what that organization is like. Is it really stuffy and bureaucratic? Is it kind of more open? You can tell by the way people sort of are reacting in meetings. Are they able to challenge or, arguments or not? Or are they very sort of deferential? So there's different ways. Culturally, of course, you have to take that into account. So a lot of my work has been around working across many different countries and different cultures. But there is a kind of fundamental piece about how do people, when I think about organizational culture, I think, how do people act and respect one another in an organization?
Great response. Thank you. And what are some of the common characteristics of a toxic organizational culture?
Oh, the common ones. I mean, it starts kind of very, really with probably allowing some inappropriate behavior. Maybe there's some bad language, or there's rudeness, or there is people being excluded from different meetings. I mean, I would suggest, for listeners, around this sense of feeling excluded, to feeling, that being really sort of criticized for some of the work that they've done, maybe sort of unfairly, maybe called out, how that criticism is delivered, perhaps in the open office with other colleagues there. Those are kind of elements of a toxic culture. And then what I found in my research in looking at that's a kind of stage one, and was actually 4 stages, because toxic cultures don't happen overnight. They happen over a period of time. And there are 2 drivers that drive toxic cultures. Those drivers, one of those drivers would be beginning to accept the unacceptable. So accepting unacceptable behaviors as a start piece, and beginning to see that. And the second piece is then is what's called cognitive dissonance, which is this ability we have as humans to be able to hold two sort of opposing ideas in our head, but basically saying, you know, we do this. This is how we show up in the organization, and we advertise and we promote ourselves. A little bit like VW, that was promoting itself as being really around leading the charge around climate and carbon emissions, only to find behind the scenes that what they were doing was trying to fool the regulator in California. So those two things do drive cognitive dissonance, and accepting the unacceptable are drivers there. So over time, when you get to stage 4, the organization, the naysayers and the people who are saying this isn't right have either left the organization or been asked to leave the organization, and you're left with almost what I would regard as a cult, and that you cannot see that maybe there's some real wrongdoing going on. And in my research, in looking at organizations, you know, from Wells Fargo, VW, Uber, you know, a number of those organizations, they all experience this, and it takes a lot of time and energy to fix a toxic workplace culture.
Very interesting. And given the fact that, you know, if an organization is able to identify that it has some toxicity in their culture, so to speak, what steps can they take to start moving towards a more healthy culture?
That's a really good question, and one that I developed was what I call the respect framework. And I think, you know, culture just doesn't stay static. You know, you bring people in, people leave an organization, or cultures are always evolving and changing. So organizations and chief executives would be well advised to look at the respect framework. So start to measure, you know, you say, you know, we have these values, we've got these company values, we advertise them on the website, and then say, okay, well, do you measure those values? Do you see people role model those values? How do you promote people? Do you use that in part of the promotion criteria? Do you evaluate how people are feeling or measure those values through an engagement survey? And so often I find that they don't. And so really being just taking the time to really address, look, are there pockets of toxic culture? Having been in HR for more than 35 years, you get pockets of toxic culture. The thing with toxicity is it can spread like a disease. So it's really understanding where are those hotspots, how are we going to deal with that? Is it a particular individual? Is it a team? Is it what interventions? So the respect framework looks at 7 key interventions, you know, from training, development, surveys, making sure that, you know, there's whistleblowing options and that they're seriously heard. There's a whole series of different interventions, but they have to happen at the same time. They're not just one, there's not one simple solution. So you also asked at the beginning, and I'm sorry I didn't answer that question. You said, you know, how important is it to an organization's success with culture? I'd say it's the most critical part for an organization. For a sustainable organization, you need a real positive, healthy workplace culture. What I found in my research is those organizations that had been financially, you know, financially success. If you take something like Uber in 2017, when there were the allegations of sexual harassment, it wiped billions off their share price pretty much overnight. And that's because they hadn't listened to what was going on inside the organization, hadn't taken seriously some of the whistleblowers. So when that story came out, it's completely damaging. So a culture can make or destroy your corporate reputation.
Well said. My next question for you, Susan, is what are some of the key elements to sustain a positive and engaging workplace culture?
Those key elements are just continuously monitoring and measuring those, asking individuals, you know, asking for surveys, anonymous surveys, having that sort of feedback, ensuring that you're really listening to what people need within the workplace. But I think one of the key parts is quite frankly really training and developing line managers. You know, a line manager has such an important impact on individuals' health and well-being. It's probably it's more so than a doctor even. Would you believe that a line manager can actually have that impact on workplace stress? So a huge amount around that. So, and we've forgotten sometimes that managers need to be trained, they need to develop, they need to learn, how do I handle difficult conversations? You know, how can I say no? What does it mean to be a leader? What does it mean to be a manager? How do I, you know, so, and I think as leaders and managers, we're always learning in many respects. And I think having that support mechanism for leaders and for managers, showing what a good role model of a leader and manager that you'd want to see in your organization is really important. It is incredibly powerful. So that learning is the continuous, that really is those aren't, you know, training and development budgets are often the things that get cut, but they're so critical to the culture of the organization and to its success.
Well said. You know, another question I wanted to get your perspective on is, you know, remote working and impact on organizational culture. Because I remember when I was a much younger manager and then in senior management roles, there used to be always a cup of coffee, you'd walk around, and I used to call it management by walking around, or meeting at the coffee machine or at the photocopier or the water cooler or something. But I'd love to get your perspective on how has the rise of remote work impacted organizational culture?
You know, it's a really interesting question because it's something we never really anticipated, I guess, you know, a few years before, pre-COVID. And it's one of the challenges that many of the organizations I work with discuss this. And it is around, you know, it's not about, you know, having games played on, you know, remotely, or those type of initiatives that sort of came in, or having a drink at a certain time or a cup of tea, you know, and everybody meets up. Those are kind of platitudes, really. I think remote working is here, it's here to stay. And for those that can do it, really appreciate it. But there is this balance around being part of a team coming in. And it's really impactful, particularly on new and junior people coming into organizations. They learn so much more, you know, what 70 or 80% of the learning takes place where they see somebody more senior. How did they handle that conversation? What did they do? And those are things you need to learn, particularly really in your early days of a career. So I think it's really being respectful that we have those needs, but it is about balance at the end of the day. But the other piece I think is interesting on remote working, and something I really noticed, particularly, you know, in the early days of COVID, was that you know, the picture size, you know, if you work in some sort of traditional countries, you know, say in the Middle East, you know, people would respectfully turn off their camera because they would say, look, the leader is speaking, and we would do that. So you see culture manifest itself in different ways and through that technology. That's, you know, that people felt kind of uncomfortable, you know, that I shouldn't be, you know, here on the screen. So there's a very different way of thinking around those pieces. But I do think it's challenging for organizations where they're fully remote in building that culture. And it's something around, it becomes almost, it can become a collection of individuals as opposed to a culture and something you define that this is the way we do things in the organization.
Yeah, great response. The other aspect I wanted to get your thoughts on was the role of leadership. And I've spoken to several leaders, and a lot of them say, well, the board prescribes the outlines, but the HR department is supposed to work on culture. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but I want to get your perspective on how crucial is the role of leadership in shaping and sustaining culture.
Absolutely critical. Leadership and culture are two sides of the same coin. You can't do culture without leadership and vice versa. And I always find it, you know, it's that, well, HR can manage culture. That's impossible. It's an absolutely impossible task. And in fact, HR becomes part of that culture. So if you've got organizations that may be hard driving, focused on numbers and metrics and performance, you'll find an HR department that's doing exactly that. You're looking at performance management, only being focused on those areas. Whereas if you have leaders that are kind of more concerned about well-being, you may have an HR department that's actually going out to talk to individuals, how they're doing, what's going on, listening, having a place to sort of report back. It's almost what I call, in the really positive, healthy workplace cultures, the role of HR is critical, but it's almost the one of representing organizational justice, if you like, and being respected for the role that's played there. But leadership cannot sort of say or delegate or say, culture's managed elsewhere. You are the leader, you are the culture as well. This is you, the buck stops with you.
Correct. Well said. And of course, now this is the age of startups and startup founders and entrepreneurs, varying ages. How does a startup entrepreneur work on building a culture in their organization?
Well, and I've got exactly the same in my organization. So I think that's a great question, actually. But I think it's about who you hire. I think it's around the work that you take on. I think it's the way you approach the work that you're doing, and having an ethos about, what are we around? Is it about, we want to say we respect, we may be under sort of pressures on deadlines and everything else, but how we do things around here is going to be really critical. So constantly thinking about the values and the way the work gets done and how you want to see that. So I think sometimes the pressures to drive for finance or, make sure that you've got the right sort of income coming in. Sometimes I see it in organizations that can lead to kind of poor behaviors, not necessarily inappropriate behaviors, but poor behaviors. But as a startup and a founder, if you recognize that culture is going to be the most important part to, what you want to, how you want to grow the organization, then trust that it will grow. The organizations that grow successfully often focused around the culture, right, how they want to develop and succeed. I'd say culture is key to sustainable success. No question.
Well said. One more question relating to culture, and then I have a few questions on HR for you. How should culture be managed during times of crisis or a significant organizational change?
I think culture becomes even more important. Sometimes people think it's like cultures are nice to have, and it's like, well, we're going through this crisis and we'll come to that later. It's like, no, this is really critical, because when you're going through this crisis, and I've worked with many organizations through about, particularly global financial crisis of restructuring and job losses, how you do that is going to be so important. So from an HR perspective, being really transparent and clear about what impact that's going to have, making sure that managers and HR people have the right tools, so, if there is a process of redundancy or job losses, that those are done respectfully, they're done with empathy and understanding, but recognizing, I think sometimes, that this is for the greater good and to kind of, to survive in this environment, but recognize that piece. So it's a really tough one around when I get asked this question around, well, what do we do? We're about to go through sort of this restructuring. It's really, a lot of this is take your time, do 80%, 90% preparation, how you're going to do it. Don't just go out and say, well, we're going to do then this, 10% of people are going to go. Really start to think carefully about the impact it's going to have, and ensure that you treat people equally. Sort of too often part-timers, women on maternity leave may not be sort of treated as equitably as some of their male counterparts. So it's really important to see that, because that's what you're doing, is in that moment of crisis, you are facing, this is how we will really behave. So think around how you want to be seen and what that culture looks like going forward, because you want people to stay with you as an organization once you've gone past that those, that journey of turbulence.
Well said. Thank you. So a few questions for you now on general questions on human resources. You've been, an HR leader for over 3 decades. As you look back at your life and as you look ahead, what are some of the biggest challenges HR faces today, given the rise of hybrid and remote work, given the onset of incredible technological changes, which are impacting HR systems as well?
Well, I think there's no doubt that some of the kind of more sort of some work can be done by using AI and, getting contracts written and everything else. I think the challenge for HR is to continually be critical thinkers, to really start to evaluate about how things are done. If this was the way we've always done things, think about it differently. Is there a different way? I always talk to my teams around, when we face some difficult challenges, is, well, what is the art of the possible? What could we do? And to kind of use imagination and critical thinking, to drive the profession forward. We have such a responsibility. 70% of assets of any company are usually tied up with people, salaries and pay and everything else. And we have such a responsibility to look at that. And we have an opportunity really to make workplaces positive and healthy for the future, and to have that impact on people's lives. So I was driven to write the book because I saw that whilst we talk about organizational culture, and I've been an organizational psychologist for many decades, we were not really talking about the dark side of culture. We were not really talking about the role that HR plays in that piece. And we were not talking about, well, what happens? As I said, toxic cultures don't happen overnight. So how do they evolve? What learning can we do from that? So really understanding firstly about how they evolve, but there is the middle section of the book looks at the toxic triangle. So it talks about toxic leaders. How do you identify dark traits or dark personality traits? From an HR perspective, we know there's some very good personality assessments that can be done. We can work out that maybe there's some risk factors on these individuals. If we've got key people coming into an organization that are going to significantly impact, we need to understand that. So, and we also need to understand that some of the processes and procedures and the policies that we put in place are all about the culture. So if we want to say that we want to be open and transparent, but we put in policies that say you have to be at your desk at 9 o'clock, and we'll check when you're going to come in and when you leave, and we'll report this back to your manager, that doesn't equate to much trust. So think around those policies, because those are all part of a culture.
Well said. And my last question to you, Susan, what are some of the emerging trends in human resources that you believe will shape the future of work?
I think there's 2 main trends. I mean, AI clearly is a major trend, and it's a major trend in the sense of how work gets done and what jobs will be more popular in the future. Jobs that we didn't anticipate, even sort of 15 years ago, and now, app developers, etc. Those are the areas that we didn't anticipate. The other trend, I think, is around looking at culture and organizational psychology. I think it's a really important area for sustainability and success for organizations. So those 2 would be 2 of the key trends.
Wonderful. And on that note, Susan, and your 2 interesting trends that you've just outlined, which is artificial intelligence and culture and organizational psychology, thank you so much for speaking to me about your own journey. We covered a lot of ground on culture. I loved what you told me about a respect framework that is so important to be able to work towards transforming a toxic culture. We spoke a lot about managing culture in crisis. We spoke about how culture is going to be able to either hold together an organization or not when it comes to remote work and hybrid work. We also covered some interesting points in human resources. Thank you again for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for The Brand Called You.